Fog rolled low over Millhaven that February night, thick enough to swallow streetlights whole and turn every passing headlight into a smear of white. It was the kind of cold that got into a person's bones slowly, the kind that made even seasoned officers want to finish their shift early and go home to something warm. A dusty blue hatchback. Its paint faded from years on the road. Slowed and eased toward the curb, the instant red and blue lights bloomed in its rearview mirror. Behind the wheel sat a black woman in a deep burgundy trench coat, both hands settling calmly onto the steering wheel, her spine straight, her breathing even. She didn't flinch. She didn't protest. She simply waited. The way someone waits who has done this more times than she can count. Though never quite like this, a young officer approached with a smirk already tugging at the corner of his mouth, his flashlight sweeping across her plain coat and unremarkable car before he announced, almost eagerly, that the vehicle matched a profile worth investigating further. What none of the three men standing in that fog understood was that the woman behind the wheel carried a badge that outweighed all three of their careers combined, and that within the hour, the entire block would fall into a silence, so complete it felt as though the whole city had stopped breathing. Right before nearly 30 federal vehicles came screaming down the avenue with enough noise to rattle windows for blocks. Only then would they understand exactly who they had just insulted, and exactly what they had just put at risk. For close to a year, the region had been bleeding revenue and confidence in equal measure. Cargo trucks carrying pharmaceutical shipments bound for regional distribution, warehouses were being hit with surgical precision, vanishing, along with product worth staggering sums. And each theft left almost nothing behind for local investigators to work with. No fingerprints, no witnesses willing to talk, no pattern that made sense to detectives working the case piecemeal, one file folder at a time. Eventually the shape of it became visible only to people trained to look at the whole map instead of a single street. And a joint task force was quietly assembled between the Drug Enforcement Administration and the United States Marshal's Service, operating under a classification so tight that even senior police officials in Millhaven were kept entirely out of the loop. The operation was given the name Marble Key, and command of its field work was handed to a woman whose reputation inside federal law enforcement circles bordered on legend, despite the fact that she actively avoided headlines. Her name was Renata Cole, 41 years old, a Deputy United States Marshal with more than 14 years spent chasing fugitives, dismantling smuggling rings, and slipping into criminal organizations that most agents wouldn't approach without a small army at their back. She had built her career the quiet way, without theatrics, without ever needing anyone else's applause to know her work was good. Colleagues who'd worked beside her described her the same way. Almost every time, calm under pressure that would break most people. Sharp enough to read a room in seconds. And utterly unbothered by anyone who doubted her. She hadn't needed to be loud, to be respected. She'd learned a long time ago that competence spoke louder than volume ever could. She had come up the hard way, starting as a junior deputy assigned to courthouse security before slowly working her way onto fugitive task forces that most rookies spent an entire career only dreaming about. Along the way, she had tracked men through swamp country, through gutted factory buildings, through towns she had never visited before and would likely never visit again, always arriving with the same unshakable focus that made her superiors trust her, with assignments too sensitive to hand to almost anyone else. She had testified in federal court more times than she could easily count, had trained younger deputies who now ran their own field teams, and had turned down 2 separate promotions into administrative roles because she refused to trade fieldwork for a desk and a window she'd never look out of, somewhere along the way, without ever meaning to. She had become the person other agents quietly hoped would be assigned to lead whenever a case mattered enough that failure wasn't an option. For this assignment, Renata was working deep undercover, driving an unremarkable hatchback pulled from a federal motor pool, specifically because it blended into traffic without drawing a single glance. She dressed plainly, avoided anything that might mark her as law enforcement, and moved through the city like any ordinary woman running errands after a long shift. Not even local police had been briefed on her identity or her mission, a deliberate choice made at the highest levels of the operation. Because a leak 8 months earlier had nearly blown an arrest wide open when a stray comment made its way from a precinct break room to the wrong set of ears within 2 days. Somewhere out there that night, a courier for the theft ring was expected to make contact. And Renata's job was simple: observe, track, report back, and never let on that federal eyes were watching. The operation had already consumed the better part of a year. Hundreds of surveillance hours, and the kind of interagency coordination that rarely came together as cleanly as it had for Marble Key. Analysts had cross-referenced shipping manifests, traced pharmaceutical lot numbers through half a dozen shell companies, and slowly built a map connecting a string of seemingly unrelated thefts to a single, disciplined organization operating with something close to military precision. It was Renata who had first identified the courier's regular route through this particular stretch of Millhaven. A detail buried inside weeks of surveillance photographs that no one else on the team had flagged as significant until she pointed it out. Tonight was supposed to be the night that detail finally paid off. She hadn't expected to become the story herself. 3 city police officers were patrolling that same stretch of road when their supervisor decided the shift had been too quiet for his taste. Sergeant Derek Holloway had a reputation of his own, though a far less flattering one, known among his peers for cutting corners and for enjoying the small, casual power a badge gave him over ordinary people. He'd spent close to 8 years on the force, long enough to grow comfortable with shortcuts that newer officers were still cautious enough to avoid, and long enough to convince himself his gut instincts were sharper than any training manual could account for. Beside him rode Officer Travis Reyes, a man whose temper ran hot enough that 3 prior complaints already sat in his personnel file, each one describing his tone, escalating faster than the situation ever seemed to call for. Most colleagues avoided riding with him when they had a choice in the matter, though Holloway had never once seemed bothered by the reputation that trailed his partner from shift to shift. If anything, he seemed to find it useful. Rounding out the trio was rookie Cody Vance, barely 4 months into the job, eager to prove himself, and a little too fond of pulling out his phone at the first sign of anything interesting. He idolized Holloway in the uncomplicated way new officers sometimes attach themselves to the loudest, most confident person on their shift, mistaking swagger for skill and quietly absorbing habits that would serve him badly the longer his career went on. Together, the 3 of them represented exactly the kind of undisciplined authority that gives good police work a bad name. And that night, out of nothing more than boredom and bias, they decided a faded hatchback driven by a black woman looked like an easy target for a stop. They had no idea what they were about to set in motion. The lights flared behind Renata's car without warning, and she reacted the way any trained federal officer would, in an undercover posture, calmly, deliberately, giving away nothing of who she actually was. She pulled to the curb in one smooth, controlled motion, signaled properly, and stopped exactly where the shoulder allowed. Her hands went to the wheel immediately, fingers spread and visible, because she understood better than almost anyone how quickly these encounters could spiral when nerves and assumptions took over. She had trained dozens of younger agents on exactly this kind of composure. Now she simply lived it. Holloway approached her window first, flashlight cutting through the fog, and immediately began scrutinizing details that had nothing to do with any actual traffic violation. He made a comment about her plate registration, as though something about it personally offended him, remarked on the car's worn paint, and studied her with the practiced suspicion of a man who had already decided on his conclusion before he'd asked a single real question. Renata, for her part, stayed composed, and asked politely what the reason for the stop had been. Holloway hesitated just a beat too long, revealing he didn't have a clean answer, then fell back on the vague, catch-all justification. Officers like him always kept in reserve the vehicle, he said. Matched a general profile they were watching for in the area. He circled slowly around the front of the hatchback, letting his flashlight linger on the hood. The tires, the faint scrape of rust along a wheel well, as though each small imperfection somehow strengthened whatever theory was forming in his head. When he came back around to her window, he asked where she was headed at that hour, his tone carrying the particular flatness of a man who'd already stopped listening for an honest answer. Renata told him she was driving home from work, which was, in its own careful way, entirely true. Holloway studied her for a long moment, as though the plainness of the answer itself were suspicious, and asked what kind of work kept a person out this late on a night like this. She told him only that it was government work, careful not to reveal anything that might compromise the operation, unfolding quietly around them, and watched the answer fail to land the way she'd hoped. Instead of easing his suspicion, the vague mention of government work seemed to sharpen it. Holloway traded a glance with Reyes that Renata caught easily, the kind two people share when they've already decided something together without needing to say it out loud. He asked for her identification again, more firmly this time, even though she'd already handed it over once, and made a show of studying it under his flashlight for far longer than any routine check should require. Reyes leaned in from the other side, cutting off her attempts to clarify with a string of rapid-fire questions that left no room for actual answers. Where was she coming from? Where was she going? Why did she seem so calm? His tone carried an edge that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with control, the kind of questioning built not to gather information, but to provoke, a reaction he could later point to as justification. Behind them, Cody Vance had already pulled out his phone, angling it toward the driver's side window, narrating under his breath as though he were building content for later, rather than documenting a legitimate stop. At one point he murmured to Reyes that she didn't exactly look like someone with any real authority, a remark meant to be quiet, but sharp enough that Renata heard every syllable of it. She said nothing in response, though something behind her eyes hardened, almost imperceptibly. None of the three officers had any idea that a discreet federal surveillance camera mounted inside her hatchback's dashboard was recording every second of the encounter, transmitting quietly back to a mobile command unit 3 blocks away, where 2 junior agents watched in stunned disbelief as their field commander was treated like a suspect on an ordinary street corner. In the trunk sat a locked case, unremarkable in appearance, holding surveillance equipment and preliminary evidence tied directly to the theft investigation, the kind of item that meant nothing to an untrained eye and everything to an operation, depending on it staying secure and unseen. Holloway's attention shifted toward the trunk once Reyes mentioned it, some instinct in him sensing an opportunity to escalate the stop into something bigger, something that might justify the aggressive posture he'd already committed to in front of his rookie. He demanded that Renata open the trunk and explain what was inside the case. She refused, calmly but firmly, explaining that its contents were part of an active federal matter and could not be disclosed under any circumstances. The words landed on Holloway like an insult rather than an explanation. He told her that if she didn't cooperate voluntarily, they'd have no choice but to detain her and search the vehicle, regardless. Renata repeated, in the same even tone she'd used from the first moment, that she was a federal law enforcement officer currently engaged in an active operation, and that continuing this stop risked compromising work that mattered far beyond the three of them standing on that wet, faux-choked corner. She offered calmly to have him call a supervisor who could verify her status through the proper channel, a simple step that would have ended the whole encounter within minutes had anyone bothered to take it seriously. Holloway waved the suggestion away, almost before she'd finished making it, telling her that anyone could claim to know a phone number that would back up whatever story they wanted told. The refusal to even attempt verification said more about his intentions than any accusation Renata could have made herself. And she recognized it instantly for what it was, not caution, but stubbornness, dressed up as procedure. Reyes scoffed audibly, reaching for her door handle before she'd even finished speaking, and pulled it open with far more force than the situation called for. He ordered her to step out of the vehicle, his hand already drifting toward the cuffs on his belt, as though her compliance had never really been in question to begin with. By now, a small crowd of onlookers had gathered along the sidewalk, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices, some already lifting their own phones to record. Word of a police stop always traveled fast in a neighborhood that had grown weary of exactly this kind of treatment. And within minutes, several separate live streams were already capturing the scene from different angles. An older man near the corner shook his head slowly, muttering to the woman beside him that he'd watched this exact scene play out too many times to count, always following the same script, always ending the same way. No matter how calmly the person being stopped behaved, a teenager filming from across the street zoomed in on Renata's face, struck by how still she remained, even as Reyes's grip tightened on her arm, and later told a local reporter that her composure was the detail he remembered most clearly, more than the shouting, more than the lights, more than anything else about that night. The crowd's presence seemed to embolden Cody Vance rather than give him pause. He turned partway toward the gathering onlookers, performing for them now, instead of documenting a stop, and made a remark loud enough for the crowd to hear something about how everybody claimed to work for the government whenever they got pulled over. As though her calm insistence on her own identity were just another excuse. People used to dodge consequences. A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the crowd, though just as many faces watched with visible unease, sensing something about the dynamic that felt deeply wrong. Renata stood on the wet pavement now, fog beading on her shoulders, her expression unreadable, her voice never once rising above a controlled, measured pitch. She told them plainly that they were interfering with a federal operation currently in progress, and that every second they continued to hold her only made the consequences worse. Holloway waved the warning off entirely, telling her she could explain all of that down at the station, if it turned out to be true. It was in that exact moment, as Reyes reached to place a hand on her arm, that a dark green pickup truck appeared at the far end of the street, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed they had nothing to fear. Renata saw it before any of the three officers did, and something in her posture shifted instantly, the calm control replaced, for the first time all night, by a flash of genuine urgency. That truck belonged to the very courier the task force had been tracking for nearly 3 months. The final piece needed to trace the theft ring back to its source. She turned toward Holloway and told him, with unmistakable intensity, that he needed to release her immediately, that the man in that truck was the target of a federal investigation, months in the making, and that every second wasted now could let him disappear for good. Holloway didn't believe a word of it. To him, it sounded exactly like the kind of desperate story someone might invent to escape a lawful detention. And he told her as much, ordering Reyes to keep hold of her arm while Vance kept filming. Inside the truck, the courier had already clocked the flashing lights, the gathering crowd, and the unmistakable shape of a federal surveillance vehicle parked half a block away. Details his training had taught him never to ignore. He didn't wait to find out what was happening. He simply cut the wheel, executed a sharp, illegal U-turn in the middle of the street, and accelerated away from the scene entirely, taking with him the last realistic chance the task force had of tracing the supply chain back to its origin. Months of careful surveillance, of painstaking financial analysis, of undercover positioning that had taken federal agents weeks to establish without blowing their cover. All of it was unraveling in real time on a fog-choked street corner, because 3 officers had decided a woman in a faded hatchback looked suspicious enough to detain Renata's radio, clipped discreetly beneath her coat. crackled to life at that exact moment. The voice on the other end, urgent and unmistakably professional. Marshal Cole. The target is moving. Requesting immediate status. The transmission cut through the tense silence on the street with a clarity that left no room for doubt. All three officers froze. Holloway's grip on his flashlight went slack. Reyes's hand fell away from her arm as though it had suddenly caught fire. Cody Vance lowered his phone for the first time since he'd raised it, his expression shifting from smug amusement to something closer to dawning horror. Within minutes, the quiet street transformed entirely. Headlights poured in from every direction as nearly 30 federal vehicles converged on the block. Engines roaring. Sirens loud enough to draw residents to their windows up and down the street. Agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration arrived alongside additional deputy marshals and officers from Homeland Security investigations, all moving with the practiced urgency of a task force that had just watched its operation nearly collapse in real time. A senior agent stepped out of the lead vehicle, fog beading on his jacket almost instantly, his eyes scanning the scene with barely restrained anger. He didn't waste a second on pleasantries. "Who detained Marshal Cole?" he demanded, his voice carrying easily over the noise of the gathered crowd. Silence answered him. Holloway opened his mouth to speak and found nothing useful, came out. Reyes stared at the pavement. Cody Vance's phone, still recording, captured the sound of his own breathing, growing shallow and uneven. Renata stepped forward then, calm, even now, and reached into her coat to produce a small leather case. She opened it in one practiced motion, revealing a steel-toned badge that caught the reflected glow of the surrounding emergency lights. The crowd on the sidewalk went utterly still. Even the people still live-streaming seemed to forget, for a moment, that they were supposed to be narrating what they saw. Holloway's face drained of color as the reality of what he'd just done settled over him fully for the first time. The senior agent turned toward the three officers, his expression carved from something colder than the fog around them. "You just compromised Operation Marble Key," he said, each word landing with the weight of a door closing somewhere far beyond their control. Renata didn't spend a single moment on recrimination. There wasn't time for it. And more importantly, it wasn't who she was. Within seconds, she'd climbed into the lead SUV, already issuing directions to the driver and coordinating with agents over a secure channel, as though the humiliation she'd just endured on that street corner had simply evaporated the instant real work demanded her attention. She called out coordinates, ordered units to fan out along likely escape routes, and requested aerial support without a trace of hesitation in her voice. The three officers could do nothing but stand at the edge of the operation now, spectators to the very crisis their own actions had created, watching as the woman they'd mocked minutes earlier transformed into exactly the kind of decisive, commanding presence that justified every ounce of authority she carried. For the first time, the crowd watching from the sidewalk saw clearly what kind of person had been standing in the fog with her hands calmly on the wheel, refusing to raise her voice even as she was pulled from her own car. The pursuit that followed cut through the city with a tension that left everyone monitoring it from the command channel, holding their breath. The courier, now fully aware he was being hunted, wove through side streets and back alleys with the kind of practiced evasive driving that suggested he'd rehearsed exactly this scenario more than once. Federal vehicles struggled to keep pace without revealing their positions too early, wary of spooking him into abandoning the truck entirely and vanishing on foot into neighborhoods that offered 100 places to disappear. Renata studied the live tracking feed with an intensity that silenced even the most seasoned agents riding alongside her. She had spent months building a mental map of this man's patterns, his preferred routes, the handful of properties connected to the theft ring's known associates, and she used every fragment of that knowledge now, calling out probable turns before they happened, redirecting units seconds ahead of the courier's own decisions, sensing the net tightening around him. the courier made a desperate move toward the edge of the city limits, clearly hoping that crossing into a different jurisdiction might buy him enough confusion to slip away entirely. It was a reasonable gambit under different circumstances. It failed completely against an operation commanded by someone who had already anticipated exactly this possibility. At one point, the courier attempted to double back through a narrow alley behind a row of shuttered storefronts, a move that might have worked against a less experienced pursuit team. Renata had already flagged that alley on the tactical map hours earlier, one of a dozen alternate routes she'd memorized during her own reconnaissance of the neighborhood weeks before, and she redirected a unit there without hesitation, closing the gap before the courier had even finished the turn. He emerged from the alley to find flashing lights waiting for him, and swore loudly enough that the agents monitoring radio traffic could hear it clearly. Before wrenching the wheel and speeding off in yet another direction, Renata ordered a rolling roadblock assembled 2 intersections ahead of his projected path, coordinated a low-altitude helicopter to track his position from above, and synchronized the movement of 4 separate ground units so precisely that the courier found himself boxed into a dead-end service road before he even realized what had happened. There was no gunfire, no reckless chase scene worthy of an action film, only careful, disciplined coordination, executed by someone who understood that the mission mattered more than any personal vindication she might have wanted after the humiliation she'd just endured. When the vehicles finally converged around him, the courier sat frozen behind the wheel for several long seconds, staring at the wall of headlights surrounding his truck from every direction, clearly calculating whether any option remained open to him. None did. Agents approached from multiple angles with practiced discipline, and within moments he was out of the vehicle, hands raised, the fight visibly draining out of him the instant he understood there was nowhere left to run. He was taken into custody without incident, and a follow-up search of a nearby warehouse turned up a truck loaded with evidence connecting the theft ring to a much larger network than investigators had initially suspected: financial records, weapons, and enough documentation to unravel the entire operation from top to bottom. Agents who had spent months on the case gathered afterward, exhausted but relieved. And more than one of them said the same thing in different words without Cole's read on that pursuit. The entire case would have slipped through their fingers on a fog-soaked street corner, because 3 officers never should have pulled that trigger in the first place. Word of what had happened traveled up the chain far faster than anyone on that street corner could have anticipated. Within hours, the Department of Homeland Security had opened a formal review into the traffic stop, treating it not as a minor disciplinary matter, but as a serious breach that had nearly derailed a federal operation months in the making. Every available piece of footage was pulled for examination, and there was no shortage of it. Body cam recordings from Holloway, Radius, and Vance were reviewed frame by frame. Dash cam footage from their patrol vehicle captured the initial stop from an angle none of them had considered. Streetlight surveillance cameras positioned along the block added another layer of documentation. Civilian live streams that had circulated within minutes of the incident provided yet more perspectives impossible to dispute or explain away. And most damning of all, the discreet federal camera inside Renata's own hatchback had captured everything with a clarity that left absolutely no room for interpretation. Every dismissive remark Holloway had made about her registration, and her demeanor was played back in the review. Every aggressive interruption from Reyes was documented and time-stamped. Cody Vance attempted, in a moment of panic, to delete the footage from his own phone once he realized how badly it reflected on all 3 of them. But investigators had already secured a backup from the cloud storage, his department account synced to automatically, rendering the attempt not just futile, but an additional mark against him during the review. The truth of what had happened on that street corner was no longer a matter of dispute. It was documented from 6 different angles, consistent in every detail and undeniable in its implications. Within days, all 3 officers were placed on administrative suspension, pending the outcome of a formal hearing. Their badges and service weapons surrendered as a matter of procedure, while investigators completed their work The hearing itself took place in a modest municipal building downtown, the kind of room that had witnessed countless disciplinary reviews over the years, but rarely one that carried this much weight. Seated at the front were the police chief, a representative from Internal Affairs, and an observer from the Department of Justice, sent specifically because the incident had intersected so directly with an active federal investigation. They walked through the footage methodically, comparing timestamps, cross-referencing radio transmissions, and reconstructing the sequence of decisions that had led 3 officers to detain a Deputy United States Marshal in the middle of an undercover operation. Each clip was paused, replayed, and discussed in detail, with investigators noting the exact moment Renata had offered to have her identity verified through proper channels, and the exact moment Holloway had dismissed that offer without a second thought. The Internal Affairs representative pointed out, more than once, that nearly every point of escalation throughout the encounter had come from the officers, rather than from anything Renata herself had said or done. The findings, when they came, were stark and unambiguous. The officers had engaged in a clear abuse of authority, initiating a stop without legitimate cause and escalating it based on assumptions rather than evidence. Their conduct had directly obstructed an active federal investigation, an interference that could have allowed a dangerous criminal network to escape justice entirely. Their handling of the encounter reflected a fundamental lack of professionalism, inconsistent with the standards expected of any officer wearing a badge, and perhaps most damaging of all, their actions had caused measurable harm to an operation that months of careful, difficult work had gone into building, work that had involved not just federal agents but analysts, technicians, and support staff whose names would never appear in any headline. The Department of Justice observer added a final note to the record before the hearing moved toward its conclusion, stating plainly that incidents like this one did lasting damage far beyond the individuals directly involved, eroding the trust between local departments and the communities they were meant to serve, and making the work of every honest officer that much harder in the process. Throughout the hearing, Renata sat quietly in the gallery, declining every opportunity offered to her to publicly condemn the 3 men whose actions had nearly cost the operation everything. When finally asked directly whether she wanted to address the panel, she stood, and her words carried none of the anger anyone in that room might have expected from her, and none of the anger she would have been entirely justified in feeling. She told them simply that a badge only means something when it's carried alongside responsibility, that authority without accountability is nothing more than a costume, and that the measure of any officer isn't the power they hold, but how they choose to treat the people standing in front of them who have none. The room fell completely silent after she finished speaking. Even the Department of Justice observer, a man known for maintaining careful neutrality throughout these kinds of proceedings, was seen writing something down and underlining it twice. The police chief closed the hearing by announcing that a final decision would be issued within the week, though most people in that room already understood, without needing to hear it, stated aloud exactly which direction that decision was likely to go. The consequences, when they finally came, were exactly as severe as the evidence had demanded. Sergeant Derek Holloway was stripped of his rank and terminated from the department entirely, his years of seniority offering no protection against a case this thoroughly documented. He left the building that day without speaking to any of the reporters gathered outside, his career effectively over in a profession where word of an incident like this one traveled fast enough to close most other doors before he'd even finished packing his locker. Officer Travis Reyes was dismissed outright as well, his prior disciplinary history leaving the review board little room for leniency once this latest incident had been added to his file. The 3 earlier complaints against him, which had previously resulted only in minor reprimands, were reopened as part of the broader review, painting a picture of a pattern rather than an isolated lapse in judgment, and making his termination less a surprising outcome than an overdue one. Rookie Cody Vance, given some consideration for his inexperience and the fact that he hadn't personally laid hands on Renata during the stop, was instead ordered into an extended retraining program alongside a formal disciplinary mark that would follow him for the remainder of his career, a second chance offered, only because the panel believed, however cautiously, that 4 months on the job wasn't enough time for a person's character to be fully set. Whether he would use that second chance to become the kind of officer his community actually needed remained, for now, an open question that only time would answer. Operation Marble Key, meanwhile, was declared a resounding success. The network behind the pharmaceutical thefts was dismantled piece by piece over the following weeks. Its leader eventually convicted on federal charges, carrying a sentence that would keep him well out of circulation for the remainder of his natural life. Assets worth tens of millions were recovered. And the courier, whose near escape had triggered that chaotic night on the street corner, became a cooperating witness whose testimony helped seal the case against everyone above him in the organization's hierarchy. Investigators later admitted that the warehouse raid alone had yielded more usable evidence than the entire preceding stretch of the investigation, combined financial ledgers documenting years of laundered proceeds, communication logs tying together cells of the organization that had previously seemed unconnected, and a small arsenal that, had it ever made its way onto the street, would have made future thefts far more dangerous than anything the region had already endured. None of it would have been possible without the pursuit that Renata had commanded so precisely on a night when, by any reasonable measure, she had every excuse to be too shaken to function at her best. She was formally recognized for her leadership throughout the operation, presented with a commendation during a small ceremony, attended mostly by colleagues who understood exactly how much she had endured to get there. When offered the chance to speak at length about the case, she kept her remarks brief, deflecting most of the credit toward the team that had supported her throughout the investigation. The only thing she said that anyone in that room remembered clearly afterward was simple and unadorned. A badge doesn't make anyone worthy of respect. How we treat other people is what does that. Weeks later, on an ordinary afternoon, with the sun finally breaking through weeks of grey winter sky, Renata climbed back into that same faded hatchback and drove away from the federal building where the operation had officially been closed out. Traffic moved slowly through downtown, and at a red light a young officer she'd never met before glanced over from the adjacent lane, offering a polite, unremarkable nod. Having no idea whatsoever who the woman behind that worn steering wheel actually was, Renata returned the gesture with a small, quiet smile, then eased forward when the light changed, disappearing back into the ordinary flow of a city that would likely never learn just how close it had come. On one foggy winter night, to losing everything it had worked so hard to protect. In the weeks that followed, she returned to work the way she always had, taking on a new assignment almost immediately, declining every interview request that came her way, and quietly deflecting the small handful of colleagues who wanted to make more of the incident than she felt it deserved. When a younger deputy, newly assigned to her unit, asked her one afternoon how she'd managed to stay so calm through an encounter that would have broken most people, Renata considered the question for a long moment before answering. She told him that losing her composure would have accomplished nothing except giving 3 men exactly the reaction they expected to see, and that the only real power she had in that moment was refusing to hand it to them. The neighborhood where the stop had taken place changed in small, quiet ways over the following months. The department instituted new training protocols regarding identification, verification, and de-escalation, driven in no small part by the very case that had unfolded on that street corner. Community leaders who had watched the footage circulate online used it as the basis for a series of public forums addressing exactly the kind of bias that had turned an ordinary night into a crisis, one that had nearly cost federal investigators an entire year of work. None of it undid what had happened to Renata that night, but she found a measure of quiet satisfaction in knowing that something useful had grown out of it regardless. What happened on that street corner was never really about a badge or a title, or the flashing lights of federal vehicles arriving to correct a mistake 3 officers never should have made. It was about the assumptions people carry without ever examining them. About the quiet dignity of someone who refused to abandon her composure, even while being treated as less than she was. And about a simple truth, that no uniform, no rank, and no flashing light bar can ever replace. Respect isn't something a badge grants automatically. It's something earned, moment by moment, through the choices people make when they believe no one important is watching, and through the willingness to see the person standing in front of them fully before deciding what they think they already know. Long after the case had closed and the headlines had faded, people in that neighborhood still spoke of the night the street went silent, the night a convoy of federal vehicles descended without warning, and the night 3 officers learned, in the harshest way possible, that judging someone by the surface of things will always eventually catch up with the one doing the judging. Renata herself rarely spoke of it at all. Carrying the memory the same quiet way, she carried everything else in a career built on steady hands and a mind that never stopped watching. Long after everyone else in the room had already decided, they understood the whole story.